In 1954, I took a boat to Ecuador in search of the Inca gold. I didn't take a lot to wear because the air in summer there is said not to be cold. So I went over the Andes in my undies, except that I wore a tie on Sundays, in search of the Inca gold. In search of the Inca gold. The folk in Rio stared at me, several times at least, with a curious glance as if perchance I were neither fish nor beast. So I went over the Andes in my undies, except that I wore a tie on Sundays, in search of the Inca gold. In search of the Inca gold. On the Orinoco, they stewed me in cocoa. Seemed a week or two, but it failed to render me old flesh tender enough for an Irish stew, so I went over the Andes in my undies, except that I wore a tie on Sundays in search of the Inca gold. You know, the ancient Inca is a frightful stinker. He's really a beastly chap. The Aztecs too are a scurvy crew. I wouldn't buy 'em for one brass sou. Not if you tossed in an old Hindu and a Mussulman wallah from Timbuktu and a whirling dervish with one blue shoe. I'd send them packing back to you, and that's the end of that. And I'd go over the Andes. Oh dear. Sorry. My young nephew has dash, though inclined to be brash, and at times he's a boastful young lad. Having climbed a rocky, he became rather cocky, though his feat was performed fully clad, while I go over the Andes in my undies, except that I wear a tie on Sundays. There's an ancient tradition of naked ambition descending to me from my sire. In a light woolen vest to ascend Everest was ever his chiefest desire. But I go over the Andes in my undies, except that I wear a tie on Sundays, in search of the Inca gold. In search of the Inca gold. There's some chaps that I knew of about 62 whose hair was rapidly thinning. So they scaled the Alps in their balding scalps, just to prove that they still had an inning, while I go over the Andes in me undies. Concerned that exploring might prove somewhat boring, a colleague I have in mind sailed down the Amazon with his pyjamas on, lest to slumber his thoughts grew inclined. But I go over the Andes in me undies, except that I wear a tie on Sundays. There are those who regret the lack of a net when they feel the mosquitoes bite. But if you don't wear a stitch, then you simply must itch through the day and well into the night if you go over the Andes in your undies. Of creepers and vines I could write many lines, or compose a mournful song, but Amazon thorns and buffalo horns I'd prefer not to dwell long upon when I go over the Andes in me undies, even when I'm wearing a tie on Sundays. My great aunt Matilda, though truly it killed her, must conquer Mont Blanc's southern face. She completed the trip in only a slip of satin embroidered with lace. While exposed on a spur, she discarded her fur and carelessly flung it away. But on reaching the top, she succumbed to the dropsy and perished the following May. But I go over the Andes in me undies, except that I wear a tie on Sundays, in search of the Inca gold. I've endured the jibes of the native tribes and the scorn of civilized folk. For to walk the tracks without one's tax must at times appear a joke. For though King Canute in his bathing suit might ignore the ocean's whim. Still a mountaineer in his underwear has no choice but to sink or swim when he goes over the Andes in his undies, even if he's wearing a tie on Sundays in search of the Inca gold. And so, my friends, my story ends with a word of advice or two. Learn from the mistakes of us sad old rakes. And there's one thing you must never do. Don't go over the Andes in your undies, even if you're wearing a tie on Sundays in search of the Inca gold, because it's jolly cold.